Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming back to the Hilltop. Thank you for coming back to Dallas Hall and the Center for Presidential History. I have not seen you all in a while. I am still alive, so in case you were wondering, it's touch and go there for a while. But it's wonderful to see you after being away for so long, and wonderful to be able to have you join us for this evening tonight where we are celebrating our book prize. I'll talk about that in just a moment. A few other announcements I wanted to make. You'll see the slides shuffling through, and they will give you all kinds of fun information, but most important of them is a couple things. The first is I want to tell you about the things that you can't do, and then the things that you could do. The first thing you can't do is you can't join us this year on our trip to study World War II history in Sicily and Italy because it's already full. I'll just let that sink in. What you can do is sign up for next year's. So if you're interested in traveling with us, it's a wonderful experience. We have students and alumni together, friends of the university. I tell you, there is nothing more fascinating and nothing more fulfilling than watching an intergenerational conversation occur as we're studying history. To see someone who's 18 and someone who's 78 try to understand this moment together. It's a fascinating experience. And I also have to say, the food's pretty good too. So, in fact, that's actually the reason we do it. Go to D-Day every other year because I have to have a certain level of foie gras in my blood at all times. So you can do that. Another thing which you could do, if you're interested, is signing up for our Article 2 Society. It is our way that we have support from our friends, and we do remarkable fun things for the Article 2 Society. We just took them, for example, on a special tour of the vault in the George W. Bush Library to see the things that you're not allowed to see. That was pretty cool. So if you're interested in supporting CPH and its work, and especially its student funds, please consider joining that. We can give some information on the back desk and also on our computer. Speaking of support, I do want to take a moment to note that we have two major issues of support to announce to you. The first is, this is of course a book prize. We are deeply and profoundly honored to be able to give this award through the generosity of one of our supporters. That person chooses to remain anonymous to you. I know who it is. But I just want to say profound thanks as a way to honor and really validate and congratulate people who have written their first books. It's a series of accomplishments, as you know, when you go through into the history world. First you have to pass comps. Then you have to get your PhD, then in theory you get a job, or postdoc, even better. And I think the one that's most personal, the one that people kind of tear up the most, is when they finally hold their book in their hand. It's much better than a baby. You put it on the shelf and walk away. But it is a remarkable thing, and I'm very thrilled that, as you see the slides go by, that we have so many of our postdocs who have done that job and created their first book and then moved on, some of them, in fact, to their second book at this point. And so I'm thankful to our donor for the opportunity to honor people who finished their first book in presidential history. There is one more announcement I want to make about support. Again, this is something you can't do, but you can know about it. And that is that I'm very proud to announce that our center was just the recipient of a very, very large grant from the Department of Education. Yes, it still exists. At least the office in the Department of Education that still exists, to celebrate America 250. We are going to, for the next 3 years, be having 80 to 100 K through 12 teachers on campus in the summer to spend an intensive week with our fellows and our professors studying the Declaration of Independence, the American Revolution, and then the Constitution. So we are thrilled to be one of the about 75 places in the country that the Department of Education still thought was worth giving them the opportunity to teach history. So you can interpret that however you want. We're very excited about that. But what we're really excited about is our event tonight. Again, I mentioned this is a wonderful opportunity to honor a first-time author. We get a remarkable number of submissions for this prize. Actually, what's been fun is that every year we get more and more and more submissions as more people hear about it. So you got in at a good time. And it's going to be incredibly prestigious in the future. And I am really thrilled to be able to introduce Susan Gaunt Stearns, who is an associate professor at the University of Mississippi, and she is going to be presenting to us her prize-winning book, Empire of Commerce. The floor is yours.
I think it's done there.
Oh.
Sorry. Or that works too?
Yep, okay.
Great.
Hold on. This is the only thing I know how to do. Apparently not. There you go.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming, and thank you so much. Thank you so much to the Center for this award. I want to make sure that the microphone is picking me up, if possible. Thanks. Sorry. I've been sitting in the back of a lot of lecture halls recently, and I don't know about you, but my hearing is not what I would hope these days. That being said, thank you so much for coming. I want to start off today by talking to you guys about this guy. So on July 15th, 1789, 6 weeks after George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the United States, this young man, who at the time was just 22, stood before the governor of Spanish Natchez and swore his allegiance to the crown of Spain. Now, do you guys know who this is? This is, yeah. He doesn't quite look like himself, but he does look like himself here. So 40 years after, 40 years before Jackson's elected president, he's standing on the bank of the Mississippi River swearing his allegiance to a foreign power or to, another government. And we have to ask ourselves, okay, why is this happening? And the answer to that is what we're going to be talking about today. In 1784, Spain closed the Mississippi River to American trade. And that raises a lot of questions. The first one is why would they close the river to trade? The second one is probably how do you close a river? That's a great question. But what we're really going to talk about today is the problem that was caused for the United States, or the series of problems that were caused for the United States by the closure of the Mississippi. In the 2 decades following the American Revolution, the Mississippi question, the question of how and when and to open the Mississippi, or whether it could be done, was the most important question facing the new United States. It was the most contentious question. It raised a lot of questions for early Americans that we are still struggling with, I would say. What type of union did they want to create? What does a government owe to its citizens? And what do citizens owe in return? And lastly, how could a government that stretches from commercial New England to the slave-owning South, to the new settlements of Kentucky and Tennessee, how could that new nation somehow grow to include them all? And my goal here for today is to trace for you parts of my book, which tells the story of the Mississippi River and the American founding. Ultimately, my book is going to argue, spoiler alert, it's going to argue that territorial expansion depends on commercial expansion, that Western settlement is driven in part by the spread and the creation of new networks of trade. The book arose from a central question, which is, what does the American founding look like if we tell the story of it from the perspective of the American West? So this is a really important question as we approach the nation's 250th anniversary. The story of the American founding isn't just George Washington's story from standing, being inaugurated in New York. We've got to figure out how do we include Andrew Jackson's story in that too, from the perspective of standing on the beach in Natchez. Actually, I'm sure it's not a beach. Actually, it's pretty unpleasant. The water edge in Natchez, even then, probably wasn't the awesomest smelling place. Just thinking about that. Okay, but never mind. So because I'm receiving an award for writing a presidential history, which is amazing because I didn't set out to write a presidential history, I want to focus today on the experiences of 5 U.S. presidents as it related to the Mississippi River. We're going to start off with Andrew Jackson and the role that the river meant for him. One of our presidents is only going to make a tiny little cameo in the whole thing. But it's really important for us to consider the role that the river played in the presidencies of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, even though none of them ever saw the Mississippi River. And in fact, Andrew Jackson is the first U.S. president to have ever seen the Mississippi River when he's elected. Okay, so let's talk for a little bit. We're going to start off with Jackson because that's where we began. So we'll start off with Jackson and talk a little bit about him. So beginning in 1775, tens of thousands of American settlers began flooding across the Appalachian Mountains to settle in the new communities in what are now Kentucky and Tennessee, and at the time were the westernmost parts of Virginia and North Carolina, respectively. A lot of these men were men like Jackson. So when Jackson first came across the Appalachian Mountains, he was a 20-year-old veteran from the American Revolution. He, like many others, came out of the American Revolution materially much worse off than he went into it. He joined the Army at the age of 13 and served as a courier for the U.S., for the Patriot Forces. And during the war, he lost 2 brothers and his mother, and was imprisoned for a couple of months in a British prisoner of war camp. And so he comes out of the war, at the age of 16, completely alone, the 3rd son of a marginal farming family with no inheritance and very few prospects, really, for what he's going to do. And so for Jackson and for the tens of thousands of other people, former veterans who found themselves during the war having lost wages from their husbands or their sons, or who'd found their crops impressed by British soldiers or by American soldiers for that matter, or who had found that the money that they were paid became worthless before they had a chance to spend it, because there was a huge amount of inflation and deflation during this time period. For all those people, they were struggling to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to make a life for ourselves now? And for many, like Jackson, they found an answer in the West. And what they were looking for in the West was land. In the 18th century, land is how you become a full citizen, right? By owning land, that's your best chance for becoming prosperous. It's your best chance for becoming, for voting, for getting the opportunity to exercise political rights. And, for many people, it's the way you get a chance to get married, right? Is if you have some ability to say, we're going to eventually have land together, that makes the chance of you finding a marriage prospect much, much higher. And so Andrew Jackson and tens of thousands others looked to the West to try to do that. But really quickly, they discover a big problem. And it's probably a problem that you've discovered in your life too, which is basically living is expensive, right? Kentucky and Tennessee had incredibly great soil, and the people who moved to the West, the settlers who moved to the West, could very quickly produce flour, they could produce corn, they could produce pork and whiskey, which are both byproducts of corn. But what they couldn't do was grow sugar, or coffee, or bullets, or axes, or guns. All those things have to be paid for. And so did the land that brought them to the West in the first place. At the end of the American Revolution, the states of North Carolina, the state of Virginia, and the U.S. government are all extremely poor. I mean, when I say that the U.S. government was poor, it came out of the American Revolution with basically no cash on hand. At one point in 1784, the U.S. government borrowed $16. So they've got no money. And so when the state governments, or when the federal government a little bit later on starts thinking about Western land, they want to sell it. And they're going to insist on cash payment for land. But how does a guy like Andrew Jackson get cash? How do you get cash in Kentucky? And by cash, I do mean literally gold and silver, but also to some extent like paper money. It doesn't literally grow on trees, so they've got to figure out some way to get it. And the best way, the way they hope that they're going to be able to get it, is to try to pay for the land that they want with the produce of that land, right? They're essentially saying, if you let us settle here, if you let us grow stuff on this farm, we'll sell the stuff that we produce, and then we'll pay you with that money. Kind of a mortgage system, essentially, is what they're hoping to create. But right away, they really run into a problem, which is, how do you get the stuff that they produce to market? The stuff that Kentucky and Tennessee can produce is things like flour. It's things like pork. These things are heavy. And if you are trying to go over land from Kentucky or Tennessee back to the eastern seaboard, there's only one road that you can take. It goes through the Cumberland Gap. Until the 1790s, the road wasn't wide enough to allow more than one horse to pass through it, in single file. You're not taking a wagon of heavy stuff back through this path, right? I mean, even today, it's not fun to drive on these roads. So the farmers of Kentucky really can't go overland to bring the flour and the whiskey that they're producing to markets. Because even if they did, even if once you get through the Cumberland Gap carrying all this heavy stuff, you're then in the middle of the Shenandoah Valley where absolutely no one needs to buy the things that you have produced because they can produce exactly the same things themselves. So the best way that they're going to be able to export goods is going to be by water. But here they run into a second geological problem, or problem created by geology. The problem is this: the rivers of the Transappalachian West flow to the west. So I don't know if you remember, but back in 4th grade, I learned about the Continental Divide. You probably did too. And it was the imaginary line where water that falls to the west of it goes into the Pacific, and the water that falls to the east of it goes into the Atlantic. Well, it's actually a little more complicated than that. There are actually 6 continental divides in North America. And one of them is the Appalachians. Water that falls on the eastern side of the Appalachians that flows into the Hudson or the Potomac or the York River will flow straight into the Atlantic. But if it falls to the west of the Appalachian Mountains, anywhere between Pittsburgh and Denver, it's going to end up in the Gulf of Mexico. And so the water of the rivers flows westward and southward. Now, for us, this isn't something we have to spend a lot of time thinking about, but in the 18th century, they haven't yet invented the steamship. And when you don't have a steamship yet, you are sort of at the mercy of the current of rivers. The main way that people who traveled by river in this time period did it was in something called a flatboat. This is an example of a Kentucky flatboat. It's basically a box that floats. They're really pretty easy to build. Most farmers at the time would have had the skills to build them, although ironically, when they built this one at the Ohio River Museum in Marietta, Ohio, they put it on the water, and the first thing it did was sink. So as you guys can see, it's on blocks outside the river. But when people who came to the west by water came down the Ohio River, they came from Pittsburgh, and they would build a boat like this. They'd load it up with everything they owned, including all their cattle, their horses, their chickens, and come downriver in a boat like this. And the thing about this boat is that it's pretty good for carrying large amounts of large quantities of stuff, but it can only go with the current. This is not an aerodynamic piece of machinery, right? It's not going back upriver. When a flatboat reaches its destination, it's usually broken up for firewood or actually repurposed into a door or a roof or a floor of the place where it ends up. And there's actually, there were a bunch of houses in New Orleans that were like that, for instance. The only way you can get upriver, actually, is in something called a keelboat. And this is an image of the flatboat over there versus the keelboat over here. And keelboats actually are very different from flatboats. So flatboats typically might have had a crew of about 4 or 5 people. A keelboat, in contrast, had a crew between 20 and 40. They're long, they're skinny and narrow, and what makes them different is that they are able to sort of take advantage of the area close to the shore where they can go kind of against the current. The workers on a keelboat would pull the boat upriver, they would row the boat upriver, they would sail it, they would pull it, they would go on shore and literally pull it like they were horses. They would winch themselves upriver. Typically, they could go at about 8 miles a day in this labor. It was incredibly difficult and agonizing to do. So for example, in a flatboat, you could go downriver with the current from Louisville to New Orleans in the period of about 5 weeks. If you wanted to go by keelboat from New Orleans to Louisville against the current of the Mississippi and then against the current of the Ohio, it might take you about 6 months. So going west and south is easy. Going east, extremely difficult. And then again, even if people in Kentucky or Tennessee were trying to export goods by water eastward, again, what they produce is flour and whiskey, and that's exactly what they're making up in Pittsburgh anyway. They're still miles and miles and miles away from market. So what they want to do, what they're hoping to do, is to carry their goods down the Ohio River and then down the Mississippi to New Orleans, where in New Orleans, they hope that ocean-going vessels will be able to come and take the produce and sell it to places like the Caribbean, and then maybe even to Europe, the eastern seaboard, places where there are population centers that do need food. And that's their goal. That's what they hope they're going to happen. But the key word here really is hope. They immediately encounter a really massive setback when, in 1784, Spain closes the Mississippi River to American trade. So these tens of thousands of people who moved to the West had this idea that they're going to be able to sell their goods down the Mississippi and use that money to buy land. But it turns out that almost immediately, that plan just isn't going to fly. Spain is not going to let them actually sell through the port of New Orleans. So let's take a second and rethink how we think about early America. We're all pretty familiar probably with the 13 original states, but let's look at this from the perspective of the Trans-Appalachian West. So the area here in white, what's now the 13 states on the east, as well as the future Kentucky, the future Tennessee, that's all part of the United States, as is the pink area north of the Ohio River, which is the Northwest Territories. And after the American Revolution in 1784, all those parts are part of the United States. But where they run into a really big problem has to do with this blue area. All the green stuff is owned by Spain, but the blue area is contested. And the reason it's contested is that during the American Revolution, the United States had allied with France against England. A little bit less frequently do we consider the fact that Spain had also entered the war. But Spain was an imperial power, and it had no interest in supporting rebellious colonists. That's not like a thing that Spain wants to encourage. So they weren't willing to ally with the United States, but they were more than willing to go to war against England. So they'd entered the war as a co-belligerent. What that meant is that at the end of the war, when they're negotiating treaties, there's 2 treaties that get signed. The first treaty is signed in the morning, and it's signed between signed between France, England, and the United States. And the second treaty is signed in the afternoon between Spain and England. And the treaty that's signed in the morning with England, the United States, and France grants to the Americans 2 things. It grants to them all the territory of what had been West Florida. That's all the stuff north of the 31st parallel, roughly the modern-day border between Georgia and Florida. All the stuff north of that. The British-American Treaty grants to the United States. And they also grant to the United States the right to navigate the Mississippi River, which England had held because it had held territory on both sides of the river. Then in the afternoon, when they signed their second treaty, they make a slightly different claim. What they do in the afternoon in the English and the Spanish treaty is they give to Spain all the land that it had conquered during the Revolution. So between 1779 and 1781, Spain had defeated the British at Baton Rouge, at Natchez, at Mobile, and at Pensacola. And it had gone as far upriver as Paducah, Kentucky. And so Spain is now claiming all that territory for itself. And the treaty says, yes, that all that territory is its as well. And so the question becomes, after the war, we've got these 2 powers that are both claiming this region, and neither side, can actually force the other side to acknowledge their claims, essentially. Now, had you stood anywhere, pretty much, on this map, you would have had no idea that it was British or American or French or Spanish, nothing. It was Caddo, it was Creek, it was Cherokee, it was Shawnee, it was Chickasaw, it was Choctaw. all indigenous peoples had a huge influence on the development of early America and on Western expansion and, on the United States more broadly. But if you're sitting in Philadelphia or if you're sitting in Madrid, these lines that they drew on maps really mattered. And so in 1784, Spain closes the Mississippi River to American trade, and it does it for two main reasons. The first reason is that they want to stop Western settlement. They're scared by how quickly Americans are flooding over the Appalachian Mountains. They've seen enough by this point to know that the American colonists are not the greatest neighbors when it comes to respecting the boundaries of their neighbors, essentially. So they're a little concerned by that. They're worried that the Americans are going to get too close to their gold and silver mines in places like Mexico. The second reason that they do it is that they want to force the Americans to acknowledge their claims in this region. They want to force the Americans to acknowledge their territorial claims. And then I said two reasons, but there's actually a third, and the third is really important as well. They want the Americans to give up their claim to being able to navigate the Mississippi. As you can see on the map, Spain does definitely own everything west of the Mississippi River, but it also owns what became the colonies of East and West, the Spanish colonies of East and West Florida as well. It owns both sides of the Mississippi River. And when you own both sides of a river, when a river flows entirely through your territory, then absolutely a country has the right to say, no, you can't travel through my territory. Right? So they're very angry that Britain would say that the Americans could have a right to travel through their territory, and they're also kind of angry at the Americans for even making this claim, which is on its surface really kind of ridiculous. The Americans aren't going to just be like, sure, travel down the Hudson River, we're fine with that. They're going to also, they would have also been upset by that. Okay. So the reason that they close the river is pretty clear. Spain closes the river because they know what Andrew Jackson knows. They know that if the river is closed, the value of Western land will decrease. Don Manuel Gayoso de Lemos, who would go on to become the Spanish governor of Spanish Natchez and later on the Spanish Louisiana, literally said that. The value of Western land depends upon the navigation of the river. And he was absolutely right. When the river closed, the value of Western land declined by as much as 80%. Essentially. So it disrupted this economy of Western land that had started to develop, and it caused a big problem for all the people who had moved to the West, but also for the much larger group of people who had invested in Western land, had speculated in Western land. Thomas Jefferson might have never seen the Mississippi, but he did own Western land. So did George Washington. James Monroe got the furthest west of any of the other presidents, and he too had invested heavily in Western land. So you've got these elite that are invested in the land, and now with the river closed, they're not going to be able to profit. Okay, so why Jackson agrees to become a Spanish citizen is that he wants this right to import and export down the Ohio River and to the Mississippi. As a Spanish citizen, he'll have the ability to do that. He'll have the ability to also claim land in Spanish Natchez, which is very appealing to him. And as soon as he becomes a Spanish citizen, he immediately starts importing and exporting from Tennessee. He starts with iron and then expands actually very quickly into enslaved people as well. But that is why Jackson is excited to do this. Okay. So that's Jackson's Mississippi. Let's switch gears to something that's happening at exactly the same time, Madison and Washington's Mississippi. So Madison and Washington never see the river. Washington does get west of the Appalachians. He sees what's now western Pennsylvania, but he doesn't make it as far as the Mississippi. Madison, I doubt, ever went further than home, really. He's not really a traveler. So for these two men, what the Mississippi is going to create is not the same issue of restricted trade like Jackson's finding. It's not a personal issue, but it is a national issue. For them, the real issue is going to be that the Mississippi River is going to become a proxy for the difficult question of how do you construct centralized power in a nation that has so many different and divergent interests. So we looked at the Western map. Let's look at an Eastern one really quickly. So I don't know how much you guys spend thinking, how much time you guys spend thinking about the United States under the Articles of Confederation. Am I like the only one who does that quite a lot? Probably, okay. So under the Articles of Confederation, the ruling document that governs the United States from 1775 until 1789, when the Constitution is passed, there are 13 states. And they're kind of regionally divided. There are Massachusetts, North New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island make up the New England states. Then you've got the Mid-Atlantic states of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. Delaware's thrown in there, but nobody ever really cares about Delaware. And then we've got the southern states. So you have 13 states total, and they're pretty regionally divided. You've got 4 in New England, 4 in the Mid-Atlantic, and you've got 5 southern states. Ironically, Rhode Island never shows up to Congress. They just don't usually come. So in some ways, Rhode Island kind of throws off our numbers a lot. You can expect to see that in this time period. But with the remaining states, when they hear that the Mississippi River is closed, across the board, all of them are very upset. They're angry. They are mad that Spain is threatening the viability of one of the main ways that the United States hopes to regain its financial footing, which is through the sale of Western land. Ohio is just beginning to be settled at this time period. It's just beginning to be surveyed. They want to make the money from selling Ohio that will allow the U.S. government to get onto a firm financial footing. But Spain's decision to close the river makes that really challenging. But what it brings to the fore is the real need that the United States has to negotiate a treaty with Spain. So in the winter of 1785, Spain sends a new minister to the United States, Don Diego de Garoqui. And he and John Jay, who is the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, sit down to start negotiating a treaty. And there's 3 main issues that they've got on the table. The first is the issue of boundaries. What's the part belongs to the United States? What belongs to Spain? The second issue is the navigation of the Mississippi. Spain insists that it belongs to Spain, and the United States insists that they have a right to navigate the Mississippi. And finally, the third issue is, what are they going to do about trade relations between the 2 countries? And so they've got these 3 issues that they want to negotiate. So for Western settlers who had invested heavily in Western lands, for Southerners who had invested also in Western lands, the ones who were from North Carolina and Virginia, what matters most are those 2 questions of boundaries and of Mississippi River trade. But for the people in New England and in the Mid-Atlantic, what matters most is the question of trade, right? Trade directly with Spain. And the reason for that is this guy. This is the North Atlantic codfish. You guys are probably familiar with Cape Cod. There's a reason that it was named Cape Cod. At the end of the American Revolution, the United States is in a huge national depression, and it's probably most concentrated in the New England and Mid-Atlantic regions, where prior to the war, most people had been involved in some form of maritime trade. But after the revolution, England is not going to let the United States trade with its former colonies. That's like literally the whole point that England had wanted before the war. You can't trade with anyone who's not an English colony. And now the Americans aren't English, so they can't trade with England. France allows some trade with the United States, but it doesn't have a big enough market to make up for the difference. And so New England mariners look to Spain as being a really attractive market. And the main reason for that is that Spain is Catholic. And so in the 18th century, Catholics did not eat meat for the 40 days during Lent, and they don't eat meat on Fridays. So about 3 months of the year, they need fish. And so salt fish in particular is a really big commodity in Spain. And even today, if you're ever in Spain, they eat a lot of codfish. Bacalao is a huge dish in Spanish cuisine. The second great thing about codfish from the New England perspective is that Spain pays for its imports with gold. Unlike England, which pays for most of the things it takes from the United States, it pays for it with trade goods. From Spain, they're getting gold. Spain has gold mines in Mexico, and in South America, it has silver mines. And so that prospect, the prospect that they can sell codfish in exchange for gold and silver, which they desperately need, is really attractive to the folks, well, all Americans really, but for the folks from New England and the Mid-Atlantic in particular. Okay, so the treaty negotiations start, and John Jay right away is facing a big problem. Now, who does he prioritize? Does he prioritize the southern interest of regaining navigation down the Mississippi River? Or does he prioritize New England and regaining access to the Spanish market? And Spain is very, very clear, the Spanish official is very clear that he is not going to allow the United States to navigate down the Mississippi. So pretty quickly, John Jay decides that he's going to stop negotiating for regaining access to the Mississippi. And he and Don Diego de Garroqui spend about 18 months negotiating a treaty that would not include access to the Mississippi. John Jay, it's important to note, is from New York, which might have been a factor in his decision. Don Diego de Garroqui is also very active behind the scenes in cultivating favor amongst New England and New York politicians. He invites them out to dinner. He spends thousands of pounds, essentially, buying them oranges and cigars and fine wine and things like that. But he's doing his best to get the Americans to give up their claim to the Western Territory and to the Ohio River. Okay, so John Jay is asked to bring the treaty he has negotiated to Congress, and he does. And right away, one of the first things he says is that this is the best treaty I could do. And he says, as that navigation, the navigation of the Mississippi, is not at present important, nor will probably become much so in less than 25 or 30 years, a forbearance to use it while we do not want it is no great sacrifice. He's basically saying that Spain is not going to let us navigate the Mississippi. Let's just accept that Spain's not going to let us navigate the Mississippi. Besides, it's like 70,000 guys out there. They're not nearly as important as the 3 million people on this side of the Appalachians, right? Let's forget about the Mississippi for the moment and instead work as hard as we can to get a trade agreement in place as fast as we can to get money flowing into the United States. So this becomes an explosive issue, and I kind of imagine that Congress starts shouting as soon as he says this. The Southern politicians are up in arms. And the big issue is really that New Englanders are overwhelmingly happy about this, right? They're like, this would be great. It would get our constituents jobs. It would help get our economy rolling again. They're really excited about it. But Southerners and Westerners are like, no, this is land. This is going to make it hard for us to sell our Western land. But also, they're really worried about what it's going to mean politically for Western citizens. Western citizens have much easier access to Spain and to Spanish authority in New Orleans than they do to American authority. At this point in time, in the 1780s, it takes less time to sail from New York City to London than it does to walk from Richmond, Virginia, to Lexington, Kentucky. If the Americans had felt that they were too far isolated from England to be ruled by England, how are the Kentuckians going to feel once they find out that the thing that they had been most interested in has been given up by the U.S. government? So somebody for whom this is really problematic is James Madison. In 1786, James Madison was not in Congress. They had these term limit things where you could only be in for 3 years and then you had to go out for 3 years. And so he's in his not in Congress time period at this point in time. But he is constantly in contact with the members of Congress. And when he hears about John Jay's proposal to cede claims to the Mississippi, he's absolutely furious. And the reason that he's so mad is that he had been arguing for years that the United States needed a stronger federal government. And he'd been making this argument that the Articles of Confederation were inadequate, that they couldn't help the United States get its financial footing. It also wasn't helping the United States in its international negotiations. And so as he writes to Thomas Jefferson, who at the time is in Paris, he says, "My personal situation is rendered by this business particularly mortifying. Ever since I've been out of Congress, I've been inculcating on our assembly a confidence in the equal attention of Congress to the rights and interests of every part of the Republic, and on the Western members in particular, the necessity of making the Union respectable by new powers to Congress if they wish Congress to negotiate with effect for the Mississippi. So he'd been trying to argue, if you want the Mississippi, you're going to have to give the federal government more power. But now, with it clear that Eastern members of Congress are more than happy to give up American claims to the Mississippi River, the odds of convincing Westerners that creating a more powerful federal government is a good idea have declined. He's also really worried about this. Figure to yourself the effect of the treaty on the people at large on the Western waters, who are impatiently waiting for a favorable result to negotiation with Garde Key, and who will consider themselves as sold by their American brethren. Will it be an unnatural consequence if they consider themselves as absolved from every federal tie and court some protection for their betrayed rights? What is to stop Westerners from looking to Spain, or even worse, to Britain, to see if they can get help from those two powers to reopen Mississippi trade, essentially? And so this is what Madison is really worried about on the sort of the eve of writing the Constitution. So ironically, given Madison's fears, actually, it is the debate over the Mississippi that becomes one of the major forces behind that convinces Congress that they need to revise the Articles of Confederation. It's clear that the union they've got isn't working, and that as divided states, no one's getting what they want. So what they do is, during the Constitutional Convention, the Mississippi River is mentioned throughout the debates, but only kind of tangentially. But that's more probably a result of record keeping than it is of actually how much they talked about it. They keep sort of saying, as we've already talked about, the Mississippi is so important, but they don't actually include the parts in their notes about where they were actually talking about the Mississippi, but that's okay. But you can see the Mississippi in the Constitution, and you can see it in a couple of different ways. The first question is really the status of new states. Are new states created going to be that are going to be created from Western territory? Are they going to be allowed to enter the United States with the same sort of on an equal footing with Eastern states? Another question they have is about how foreign policy is going to be developed and how it's going to be sort of laid out. One of the things that Westerners and Southerners insist upon in writing the Constitution is a role for the states in foreign policy. Right? This is why we have 2/3 of the senators needed for a treaty. It's so that New England, which has a majority, right? It's got more people in New England and the Mid-Atlantic than like that was 9 states versus the southern states. They don't want those 9 northern states to be able to give up the right to the Mississippi for those remaining other states. And so, as a result, they put into the Constitution the fact that 2/3 of senators are going to be needed in order to make any kind of a foreign treaty. Okay. But the passage of the Constitution doesn't resolve their problems, especially not for the West. The Mississippi is still closed, and for George Washington, it comes to be at the heart of one of his major incidents of his term as president, and that is the Whiskey Rebellion. So I have a version of this talk that goes with whiskey. You know, different times you drink different kinds of whiskey. You guys didn't get that version, but this is one of those moments. The Whiskey Rebellion is an interesting one because it's something that sort of like, because of its name, I think it stands out to most people from when they learned early American history at some point in the past. But it's also very much a misnomer. The Whiskey Rebellion, we're told, you know, when we read about it in high school, was the result of Western anger over the Distilled Spirits Act of 1791. So the Distilled Spirits Act of 1791 levies a tax on all alcohol being produced in the United States. It's a cornerstone of Alexander Hamilton's project for putting the United States back on a solid fiscal footing. And in our traditional telling, what we see is that Western farmers are angry about their whiskey being taxed, right? And that they're very opposed to having, like, it's an infringement on their freedom, and they're upset about it. But really, in reality, this is very much sort of a misnomer. What the rebellion is, it's very much similar. So what happens is that in 1794, Western farmers do become very upset over this tax, and they burn the homes of some Western tax collectors. And that happens in Western Pennsylvania. Now, what's rarely mentioned in this story is that there's a rebellion, there's agitation about this in Western Pennsylvania, but there also is in Western North Carolina, and Western Virginia, and Western Maryland. In Kentucky, the tax collector, like the guy who they selected to be tax collector, never even tried to collect taxes. He was like, this is not gonna go well, and didn't do it. And the guy in Tennessee, they couldn't find anyone in Tennessee who was even remotely willing to take on this role. But what happens is that when they burn this house of the local tax collector, the federal government is furious. Right? This is a direct attack on federal authority. And so what happens is, in July of 1794, President Washington nationalizes 13,000 members of the Maryland and Pennsylvania and Virginia militias and marches them west to Western Pennsylvania to put down what they say is this insurrection. He uses the Militia Act of 1792 to do that. And when he gets to the West, actually, pretty much everybody who had been involved had already fled. There's definitely nobody occupying Pittsburgh when they get out there, and it ends up fizzling out. They end up ultimately arresting 7 people, convicting 2, and both of them are ultimately pardoned. But the problem with calling this a whiskey rebellion or a whiskey insurrection, which are both names that were actually given to this conflict by Alexander Hamilton, is that the name kind of evokes some derision, right? It kind of makes these Western farmers sound like basically drunks who are resentful over what are really reasonable and logical steps to put the United States back on a fiscal footing, right? We still tax sin more highly than we tax most other things, right? You'd be happier if I taxed, candy than milk, right? So sort of the same logic is at play here. But for Western farmers, the problem with the excise tax of 1791 had not been that it was taxing their whiskey. That wasn't the issue. The big issue that they had was that the tax had to be paid in cash. And so what they felt was that they were sort of being doubly attacked. The federal government was demanding that they pay them in cash, and at the same time, the federal government had not yet reopened the Mississippi. And so they couldn't get cash. And so they're feeling like they're being attacked on both sides. And one of the ways we can tell this is that just 2 months before Washington takes off into the Pennsylvania countryside, he gets a petition from one of the Democratic Republican societies of Pennsylvania. These are the men who are really at the core, at the leadership of the Whiskey Rebellion in general. They're also members of the Democratic Republican Society. And in their petition, when they spell out their grievances, it isn't, we don't want our whiskey taxed. That's not what they say. The very first thing they say is that your remonstrants are entitled by nature and by stipulation to the undisturbed navigation of the river Mississippi and consider it a right inseparable from their prosperity. And it is the federal government's obligation to provide this to its citizens. They go on to say that their complaint about the tax is this specifically: money is to be taken from us by an odious and oppressive excise, but the means of procuring it by the exercise of our just right to Mississippi navigation is denied. And this is where they make their threat. This is where we see that ghost of Andrew Jackson standing on a riverbank, swearing his allegiance to a foreign power, is coming back into play. And their response to the federal government is, your remonstrants yield not in patriotism to any of their fellow citizens, but patriotism, like every other thing, has its bounds. We love those states from which we are all congregated, but attachments to governments cease to be natural when they cease to be mutual. To be subjected to all the burdens and enjoy none of the benefits arising from government is what we will never submit to. So they're arguing that they would pay the tax if they could pay the tax, if the federal government enabled them to pay the tax. And they're very upset that the government is sort of doubly challenging them on these two levels. So Part of the issue here is that at the same time that the federal government is trying to regain access to the Mississippi River, all those negotiations are taking place in Spain. Most Americans are not too aware of like what's happening with those negotiations. Western settlers themselves are really debating strongly whether they should take matters into their own hands. Would it make sense for Kentucky and Tennessee to become their own independent states and ally with Spain? Would it make sense for them to become colonies of Spain? Individuals like, Jackson is one man, but thousands of others also became Spanish citizens in order to gain access to the Mississippi River. And if the central government can't give the West what it needs in order to become profitable, what is their relationship to the federal government? What is it doing for them if it's not enabling them to really, one way to think about this is with the Declaration of Independence, to pursue happiness. If they can't gain their land, then they're not going to be able to get happy, essentially. Right. Now things changed dramatically in 1795 when American negotiators in Spain have a breakthrough. And that breakthrough has very little to do with the United States and everything to do with Europe. In 1795, Spain is about to be invaded by France. They really don't want to have wars with anybody. They're kind of trying to figure out how can we sort of navigate this moment. And one of the things they agree to do is they agree to make a treaty with the United States. And the resulting treaty that they make is called Pinckney's Treaty. This is one of those treaties that you almost never learn about in college, but it's really important. It does two main things. The first thing is it says that the United States gets all the territory north of the 31st parallel. So it confers to the United States all that territory that had been contested between the two powers. And the second thing it does is it opens the port of New Orleans to American trade. Americans are going to be able to move goods into New Orleans and out of New Orleans without paying any taxes to the Spanish government. And so there's widespread rejoicing in Kentucky and Tennessee in reaction to this. It creates, the Chickasaw, when they hear about it, are furious. So are the Spanish. But for the Americans, this is a really major, major political victory. And in his farewell address, when Washington is saying his goodbyes to the nation, one of the things he spends most of his time talking about is about the success that this treaty in particular has brought to the United States. In his farewell address, he reminds all parts of the Union, northern, southern, eastern, and western, how much they depend upon one another. The United States, he informs his listeners, was directed by an indissoluble community of interest as one nation. By opening Mississippi River trade, Washington had brought the states one step closer to being truly united. Okay, how am I doing for time? Okay, all right. So, you guys still with me? Take a minute to stretch. Long lectures. Okay. Let's take a deep breath and talk about our last two presidents, Jefferson and Monroe. And Monroe's the guy who's going to come in really quickly and leave in this particular case. So the opening of the Mississippi River trade by Pinckney's Treaty is almost immediately successful. The produce of Kentucky, Tennessee, and the more recently settled Ohio territory begins to pour down the Mississippi. Ohio flour, Kentucky whiskey, and Tennessee pork begin to be exported through the mouth of the Mississippi River. By the fall of 1802, James Madison, who is now the American Secretary of State, reported that in the previous year, so in 1801, exports down the Mississippi River had a value of $1,622,672. And that was just Kentucky and Mississippi. And to put these numbers in perspective, by this time, the federal government had only minted about $12 million total ever in its time. So this is it's a really big chunk of money at this time. Okay. And that figure doesn't include Tennessee or Ohio either. And he predicted that the next year's produce, the numbers for 1802, would be twice as high again. And already by 1802, when Ohio Valley produce arrived in New Orleans, there were hundreds of American boats there to meet it. American ships would carry the crops produced by the West to places like Havana or Philadelphia or Liverpool in England. And one thing that the American trade really had on its side was that basically from 1792 onwards until the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, Europe's at war. And when a country's at war, it mobilizes its soldiers. It's much harder for it to feed itself. So England and France are both really interested in finding neutral traders who can bring good, like flour and other goods to feed their armies. Okay. If we think about like the 20,000 men that Napoleon will eventually send to Haiti to suppress the Haitian rebellion, those 20,000 men are eating bread made from Ohio flour. So this is what this treaty creates for the United States. It finally creates a market for Western land, and money starts flowing back to the West. The value of Western land recovers to an amount greater than it had been before the river had been closed. Okay. But Pinckney's Treaty did more than open the Mississippi. It also transferred new territory to the United States. Part of that territory included the community of Natchez. So Natchez, Mississippi had about 5,000 residents at this time. But if the world was hungry for Western food, it was even hungrier for what Natchez could make, and that was cotton. 1794 was the first year that Natchez had produced any cotton at all. And that year, they produced 36,251 pounds of cotton. By the time it became American, in 1796, or 1798, they were roughly producing 602,000 pounds of cotton. And by 1802, the cotton being produced in just Natchez alone was 4 million pounds of cotton. Cotton was a game changer when it came to Mississippi River trade. For merchants from Massachusetts, from New York, from Baltimore, all these places are very, very invested in cotton trading. And the reason for that is that this is the birth of the Industrial Revolution. England has just, Manchester and Birmingham in England have just begun to take off. And they are looking for markets for cotton, places that they can buy cotton from. And here comes this new force that's able to provide that cotton. So, all looks dandy. Kentucky has become a state, Tennessee has become a state, Ohio's on the cusp of statehood, and then suddenly, in 1802, Spain closes the Mississippi River to American trade. It closes the port of New Orleans, more specifically. The Americans are still allowed to trade, but what they're not allowed to do is unload their goods in New Orleans, so it can be like warehoused to wait for a boat to come. In other words, you can still come to New Orleans, and if there's a boat in port, you can like offload your goods onto that boat, but you guys saw what those flatboats look like? They're not really ideal for, prolonged time doing maritime ventures to them, essentially. So this becomes a big deal for Westerners. And the reason that this happens is that in 1800, 2 years earlier, Spain had actually secretly ceded Louisiana to France. It's a treaty called the Treaty of San Ildefonso. Nobody knew about it, but there were rumors going around. And the French were not particularly eager to come and take over. Spanish officials are still very much in charge in in New Orleans. But when France decides to close the port, that's what happens. Okay. So in 1806, when Spain had first closed 1804, when Spain had first closed the Mississippi River, Eastern members of Congress, men like John Jay, had been willing to cede American claims to the Mississippi in favor of trade with Spain. But in 1802, immediately across the country, you see calls for marching on New Orleans, right? Raising an army and going to New Orleans and making it American. And one of the leaders of this movement is actually Alexander Hamilton, who wants to be at the head of these troops to go conquer New Orleans and make it American. And the reason that New Orleans is so important is that if the United States can control New Orleans, it'll finally be able to control Western trade. As Jefferson writes to Edward Livingston, who at the time is the American ambassador in France, in April of 1802, he writes to Livingston, and he says, "There is on the globe one single spot, the possessor of which is our natural and habitual enemy. It is New Orleans, through which the produce of 3/8 of our territory must pass to market." Right? The United States needs New Orleans, or that 3/8 of its territory is going to be at risk. Sorry. So in reaction to this, Spain, in reaction to the closure of the Mississippi, Jefferson dispatches James Monroe to Paris to go negotiate for purchasing New Orleans. That's all he's there to do. Ideally, they want just New Orleans. If they could get it, they'd be really excited if they could get East and West Florida too. That little, the remnant parts at the bottom, they'd like those. That would consolidate everything east of the Mississippi as American territory. But when they get there, that's not what Napoleon wants to sell to them, right? He says, we'll give you New Orleans, but you have to take everything else in Louisiana as well. And they were not excited about that. They really didn't want it. At that point, as far as they knew, Kansas was basically a desert. But they were so eager to get New Orleans that they were willing to do that. Okay. And part of the reason they were willing to do it, they were willing to buy it, is that the United States was invested in gaining New Orleans. In 1803, Congress is more than happy to consider going to war to get New Orleans. A congressional committee in 1803 says that the possession of New Orleans and the Floridas will not only be required for the convenience of the United States, but will be demanded by their most imperious necessities. If the purchase can be made, we ought not to hesitate. War may be the result, but the American nation, satisfied with our conduct, will be animated by one soul and will unite all its energies in the contest. So, all of this that we've talked about, all of our, if you've got your presidential bingo card going, the Jackson, the Madison, the Washington, Jefferson, Monroe, all of their experience was with the Mississippi River and really encapsulate for us the role that the river played in helping to shape early American development. And it's really along the waters of the Mississippi that we see the West and the East really start to become truly united as one United States. So I'm going to finish my remarks here. We've talked about 5 of the first 7 presidents. We didn't talk about either of the Adamses. My favorite fact about John Quincy Adams is that he was the American translator in Russia when he was 13. So he was having a very different American Revolution than Jackson. We've talked about the first 5 of the first 7 presidents. But I want to talk a little bit quickly about what the Mississippi River means today. So in today's world, we tend not to pay too much attention to the Mississippi unless its waters are flooding or have slowed to a trickle. Anything in between is pretty easy for us to ignore. But in many ways, we ignore it at our peril. The Mississippi River Basin is enormous. Stretching from Denver to Pittsburgh, it has played a near constant role in the development of the United States. New Orleans is the single most important port for the exportation of American produce. Last year, 35% of U.S. agricultural exports flowed down the Mississippi to New Orleans. 60% of the United States soybean crop, 78% of its corn, passed along the river and out into the Gulf of Mexico, and eventually into the world beyond. But the system is precarious. Over the last 4 years, decreased rain and snowfall throughout much of the Midwest has lowered the water levels of the river significantly. The cost of shipping goods on the river is now over 60% higher than it was 3 years ago. A price change with serious consequences for you at the grocery store, but also for the global food supply. High transportation costs drive down the profitability of American farming, further straining an already taxed system. Moreover, low water levels on the river threaten more than just agricultural profits. In a typical year, 600,000 gallons of water per second flow from the Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico. But when the water level falls, salt water from the Gulf starts to creep north, threatening the drinking supply of southern Louisiana, and increasingly posing a threat to the 1.2 million people who live in or near New Orleans. This river that we largely take for granted plays an outsized role in defining this region and beyond. So thank you very much. Sure.
do have time for questions, and as is our tradition, if you don't mind raise your hand, wait for the microphone to get to you. That way everybody else will be able to hear you. Questions? It's a shy group, please.
There's a mic right there.
Hi there. Just a quick question as to maybe speculation or any insight you have as to why two different sets of boundaries in the two different treaties, 1783.
Why they do that? I think it's probably because nobody who is at the negotiations has any idea of where they're talking about. Nobody who's in Spain, or none of the Spanish representatives, none of the French representatives, none of the American representatives have ever been to any part of this region and have no concept of distances or really of spatial awareness, essentially. And I think that's probably a big part of it. I think part of it is also probably actually language. So what's translated into Spanish and what's translated from French, et cetera, ends up getting a little bit complicated, essentially. But the British representatives really should have known. They were at both treaty negotiations.
The follow-up, I apologize, is no British treachery or, underhandedness?
I don't think so. That's kind of, I think, attributing a little bit too much forethought to the British negotiators. I think mostly they just didn't really pay a lot of attention. They were kind of like, we're just getting out of the region, and that was really the big thing for them. The issues between the United States and Spain was not really Britain's concern, essentially.
You had made a point at the end there about soybeans, and there's been a lot of talk in the last week in the national press about soybean farmers in the Midwest being upset that we bailed out Argentina, and now China is buying their soybeans from Argentina instead of the United States. I know as an historian we tend to not want to forecast into the future, but is there a possibility of a similar kind of revolt that you saw with the British Whiskey Rebellion, where because the river is so expensive to transport things down, are we going to see soybean farmers or similar farmers having a similar reaction to the national government not doing more?
It's really tough to say. I think American politics now have a lot more issues at play that necessarily were going on than things that were attached to politics now are not the same things that were attached to politics in the 18th century. Also, too, they did not live in an age of instant communication, so I think that actually makes it's a huge thing to think about when you think about the original writing of the Constitution, that it takes months and months and months for anybody to get any information from anywhere else. So I think that's unlikely. What I do see that's really interesting is that the trade creates path dependencies, right? It is much easier to keep trading with the same partner as long as it's possible than it is to create a new pathway, right? You've got to create new transportation centers, you've got to create new storage facilities, et cetera, all those things. But once they're created, it's pretty easy to keep going with a new pattern that's created. And so in some ways, I think that is something that we have to consider when we think about what's happening now. I live in Mississippi, which is actually the largest soybean producer in the United States, which you wouldn't think. But it's a really big deal, in part, so.
I think we have time for one more question.
It's an impossible hypothetical, but if you could have interviewed one of the many characters that you discussed tonight, who would it have been?
Definitely Jackson or Monroe. Basically, I think Andrew Jackson actually is endlessly fascinating, and his relationship with Natchez, Mississippi is in fact really interesting. One of the things he uses his Spanish citizenship to do later on is that he falls in love with his landlord's daughter when he's a young man, and she had previously been married. And it's not clear what her marital status is, whether she's divorced or not. But eventually, her first husband does show up, and he says, we're not divorced, and he tries to sue Jackson and his wife for bigamy. And Jackson basically chases him out of the courthouse and makes him hide in the trees, and then the judge shows up and says, hey, the guy who said that you guys were being bigamists never showed up, so we're not going to have this trial, and in fact, he's got to pay the court fees. While he's like lying bleeding in the trees. But what Jackson does after that, right after that, is he takes Rachel, his wife, and he moves her to Natchez, where they're outside the reach of American law, essentially. And so I think for me, Jackson is probably, particularly at this moment in time, like the most interesting of these people from sort of like a human standpoint, essentially. Yeah.
Well, you have given us a wonderful thought about the early part of the development of our country, and have given us a great example of the way that presidential history is not what you start out to write, but it always winds up being there. So if you will please join me in thanking our prize winner. And I encourage you to circle November 6th on your calendars for our big third rail conference, where we're going to be discussing the history and evolution of executive authority and executive power. No reason why.